Das haben sie gemacht, weil sie dachten, sie haben das in einer Woche erledigt.
They did that because they thought they could wrap it up in a week. That's why the leadership figures were killed right away, both in June of last year and again this February. They believed they could put an end to the protests that had been happening in Iran. They wanted to use that moment to launch an attack on the regime, to push for regime change, and to mobilize their regional proxy forces, like the Kurds, for example, to move in and take over certain positions. That idea was completely absurd, and only shows that they don't understand Iran, just like the Europeans don't either.
Den Iran nicht kennen, wie die Europäer auch nicht.
Against the current, about the person.
Hallo bei Gegen den Strom. Ich präsentiere Ihnen Positionen.
Hello and welcome to Against the Current. I present positions and perspectives that the propaganda media prefer to keep quiet about. Does the Memorandum of Understanding between Iran and the United States still stand? Will it hold? Is it enough to end the illegal war of aggression by the United States and Israel against Iran? Is this an admission of defeat by Washington, or just another deception by Donald Trump? No one knows that better than Karin Leukefeld. She's a journalist, publicist, and author. She spends part of her time in Lebanon so she can see the situation on the ground firsthand, and she's in close contact with all sides of the conflict. Good day, Ms. Leukefeld.
Good afternoon, Mr. Baab.
What's the deal with this Memorandum of Understanding? Is it just a smokescreen, or is there actually a chance to stop the slaughter?
For
now, this basically extends the situation of mutual ceasefire. That ceasefire was agreed on April 8th, when the United States and Iran reached that deal. And now, through this Memorandum of Understanding, it's been extended for another 60 days. It effectively starts with the signing, and by the way, both presidents signed it electronically. With that signature, negotiations begin to deepen, verify, and put into practice the points they've agreed on. Those talks will take place between diplomats from both countries, in Geneva, and possibly in Vienna, depending on which issue is being discussed. It's important to note, though, that one key player in this war, Israel, is not at the table. But in the version that the United States just presented to journalists, in a 14-point statement, it says that the U.S., Iran, and all parties involved in this war, well, I think the word war might not actually appear there, but all the actors involved, meaning above all, Israel, but also Hezbollah in Lebanon, have agreed that, and so on. In other words, it means that a period of negotiations is supposed to begin now, 3 months, 60 days, during which the weapons are to fall silent. Iran has confirmed this as well. The Iranian President Raisi has signed it, including electronically.
So what does that actually mean for the fighting in Lebanon? The Israeli side has already made it clear that they're not willing to stop the fighting or the attacks.
Yes, that's right. So, at the beginning, both the United States and Israel made statements. The U.S. said that Lebanon wasn't affected, that this was a different conflict, but Israel said from the start that they wouldn't respect that. On the contrary, you might remember, when the first ceasefire was agreed on April 8th, Israel launched an incredible bombing campaign over Lebanon, with more than 350 people killed in Beirut alone within 10 minutes. That was a statement. The Israelis are really staging their contempt for their neighbors and for such agreements as well. Now, Netanyahu stayed silent at first. It took a while before he commented on it. Hezbollah, on the other hand, said they would stick to it.
Aber die Hisbollah hat ja von Anfang an auch gesagt, dass sie
But Hezbollah said from the very beginning that it would defend the country against Israeli attacks and act against the occupying forces. So it's actually a somewhat different kind of conflict. We'll probably get into that in more detail in a moment. But Hezbollah says, we're not the ones firing. Israel has fired, and there have been many border violations by the Israeli Air Force, by artillery, and from the sea. The Israelis are carrying out major military movements there, as if they're continuing to destroy and they're building their own fortifications in the area. In other words, they want to maintain their occupation of southern Lebanon. That's what Israel's Defense Minister Katz has said as well. So it's a difficult situation in Lebanon, but overall, things have remained relatively calm over the past few days.
Im Prinzip ist diese Situation ruhiger in den letzten Tagen geblieben.
Does Donald Trump, as President of the United States, have the strength or even the will to rein in Netanyahu?
Kann das ganz konkret tun. Da muss gar nicht viel sagen.
He can do that in a very concrete way, and he doesn't even have to say much. All he has to do is put the military and intelligence cooperation with Israel on hold. Israel can't really do anything militarily if it doesn't have access to that complex military system that basically operates like a network spread across the entire region, from the eastern Mediterranean all the way to Iran, almost to Afghanistan. That means that through satellites, from space, from the air, and from bases on the ground, airstrikes can be directed, carried out, and targets can be identified.
Gesteuert werden, möglich sind, Ziele identifiziert werden. Das alles läuft von Israel nur mit der Unterstützung der USA.
All of this is only happening with U.S. support. If the United States were to cut that off, Israel couldn't keep carrying out these attacks the way it has. And the second point is intelligence. Surveillance, espionage, satellites, people on the ground. That's all the information the Americans are gathering across the region. If that were no longer shared with Israel, it would send a very clear message. There's a lot of resistance to that, even within the U.S., and so he's trying to push through what he can, these verbal attacks against Netanyahu.
Diese Verbalattacken gegen Netanyahu entsprechen vielleicht auch seinem Naturell von Herrn Trump.
That probably also fits Mr. Trump's personality. But he's made it very clear, actually several times, that Israel should act differently toward Lebanon. The reason is that the United States wants Lebanon to reach an agreement with Israel, meaning real negotiations that actually have substance, unlike what's happening in Washington right now. He wants a kind of normalization of relations between Lebanon and Israel. And he's realized that Iran, which has strong influence in Lebanon, will only support and encourage that if these attacks stop.
Das nur unterstützt und fördert, wenn eben diese Angriffe aufhören.
If Donald Trump doesn't immediately end intelligence and military cooperation with Israel, is he playing a double game?
Jein, würde ich sagen. Also, weiß das natürlich, was zu tun hat.
Yes, I'd say so. He knows exactly what he would have to do to actually stop it. But he's not doing it because he's under domestic pressure in the United States. The situation there, when it comes to Israel, is that public opinion completely rejects these wars. There's also strong opposition from the Jewish community in the U.S., which has protested forcefully against the war in Gaza and now also in Lebanon. But within Congress and the Senate, he depends on their resolutions, it's on their votes, especially with the midterm elections coming up. And in Parliament, there's still a very strong majority in favor of continuing cooperation with Israel.
Mehrheit für die weitere Kooperation mit Israel. Und zwar für eine Intensivierung sogar, insbesondere.
In fact, it's about an even closer partnership, especially in military cooperation. There hasn't been much reporting on this yet. There's actually a draft resolution proposing that the Israeli and U.S. armed forces be linked more closely at the leadership level. And I think that's still a situation Trump can't fully gauge. Right now, his main concern is making sure the Republicans don't lose their majority in either chamber in the upcoming elections.
In the
midterm elections this November, the Republicans are coming under pressure. it's expected that the Democrats will gain seats. Now, when it comes to the partnership with Israel, the Democrats are basically anti-Iran hardliners as well. Does that make you optimistic? Can such a memorandum of understanding even hold up under those circumstances?
Memorandum of Understanding überhaupt Bestand haben?
When you look at the whole situation, it's hard to be optimistic right now. There are so many, well, in English you'd say spoilers. People who are always trying to find a flaw, a way to bring down something that was already agreed on. But what we're seeing at the moment is a very clear rejection of this war and growing international criticism of Israel. Whether that's just lip service or will actually have consequences remains to be seen. Or to be watched. But Iran is now stronger than before in its position because it was attacked in violation of international law. It was attacked by two nuclear powers over its alleged nuclear weapons program, which it doesn't even have. And those attacks also targeted civilians and civilian infrastructure. Even the language used, including by Mr. Trump, saying they would destroy bridges and an entire civilization. That means Tehran is now the new strong power, the dominant force in the Near and Middle East, not the United States anymore. Has Iran won the war?
Gefördert und innerhalb der Region mit den arabischen Golfstaaten steht der Iran jetzt besser da als vorher.
Das heißt, Teheran ist die neue starke Kraft, die dominante Kraft in Nah- und Mittelost, nicht mehr die Vereinigten Staaten. Hat der Iran den Krieg gewonnen?
Diesen Abschnitt wohl schon. Also von Gewinnen, das ist schwer zu
Probably
sagen.
this part, yes. When it comes to profits, that's hard to say. The losses are enormous. The Memorandum of Understanding says that the United States will provide $300 billion for reconstruction, in coordination with the Arab Gulf states, where the U.S. military bases are the ones Iran also attacked, so they'll be involved in the rebuilding process. The idea is that there should clearly be reparations, and Iran managed to push that through. But how this will play out in the long run, how stable the relationships in the region can really become, that doesn't depend only on Iran and the United States. It depends very much on Israel, on its role in Lebanon, on what it's doing in Syria, on its threats toward Yemen, and also on how the situation in Syria itself continues to develop.
Und wie sich das auch die Situation in Syrien entwickeln wird, wo ja die Türkei und auch Saudi-Arabien regionale Interessen
Turkey and Saudi Arabia both have their own regional interests. So the whole situation, as the Iranians themselves say, is very complex, and that's almost an understatement. There are so many different interests, wars, and crises that have been fueled and built up over the past years. Bringing all that together and stabilizing it through a regional process, that's definitely the goal of the Iranians. They want to strengthen regional cooperation, and they're getting support for that, for example, from countries like Russia and China. Pakistan also plays an important role, and now Egypt does too. But none of that is any kind of guarantee.
Aber das ist alles keine Versicherung.
Wir kommen darauf zurück. Ich möchte noch einen Moment.
We'll come back to that. But I'd like to stay with the United States for a moment. They've drawn down their oil reserves massively to support the oil market and bring prices down, because after the partial closure of the Strait of Hormuz, prices per barrel went through the roof. So what's the situation now? What results have they achieved? Are the ships moving again?
Wurde erzielt, fahren die Schiffe wieder.
Ja, also es ist jetzt von Medien berichtet worden, dass die ersten...
So the media have reported that the first Iranian oil tankers have started sailing again because the United States lifted its blockade of Iranian ports in the past few days. And even before the signing of this memorandum, things had already started to move. In the upcoming talks, they want to clarify in more detail how Oman and Iran can manage that passage in the future, especially through the Strait of Hormuz, and how they can be compensated financially for certain responsibilities. That's not some special request. Turkey also charges fees for ships passing through the Bosporus. So this is really just part of normal international relations.
Beziehungen auch. Aber
So the United States is trying to get oil shipments going again, to make sure the oil starts flowing once more in a way. But it's absolutely clear that because of the destruction, for example, of liquefied gas facilities in Qatar, Ras Laffan has been destroyed, and also in Kuwait, where plants have been damaged, rebuilding and repairing all of that will take a long time. It's going to happen only step by step. Now, the question is this. The U.S. had granted an exemption for Russian oil. Trump has now said he wants to revoke that by the end of the year. But I think at the moment there aren't really any clear signs of that yet. What we can see is that prices are falling. Whether that will last, though, we'll just have to wait and see.
Ob das auf Dauer so bleiben wird, das muss man auch warten.
Interessant ist ja, Sie haben es erwähnt.
What's interesting, and you mentioned it, is that Iran, with its counterattacks, has also destroyed much of the oil, gas, and fertilizer infrastructure, as well as manufacturing facilities in the Gulf states. So is the lesson for the Gulf states that America can't protect them? Or to put it differently, are the United States going to lose their vassals in the Gulf in the long run?
Ihre Vasallen am Golf langfristig verlieren.
Die Angriffe des Irans haben sich vor allen Dingen gegen die militärischen Basen.
The Iranian attacks were mainly directed at U.S. military bases, first and foremost. I believe they actually bombed at least 16 U.S. bases so badly that they can't be used anymore. That's a loss the United States doesn't really acknowledge. As a result, for example, Qatar, where the largest U.S. military base is located, has asked the Americans to withdraw their troops, meaning the base would no longer be used. Satellite and radar systems were also destroyed there, and those are very difficult to replace. It takes a long time before new ones can be produced and put back into operation.
Produziert worden sind, in Einsatz zu kommen. Und sie haben also vor allen Dingen
And they targeted production facilities, mainly oil extraction sites, especially those that were also used by the Americans for military purposes, mostly in Kuwait, but also in Bahrain. Their strategy was clear. If our oil facilities are attacked, we'll attack oil facilities too. That was a declared strategy, responding in kind to the attacks they faced. What they didn't do was attack schools the way the Israelis and Americans did. But in any case, this has led to one thing. The Arab Gulf states no longer feel protected at all.
Die arabischen Golfstaaten überhaupt nicht mehr geschützt fühlen. Das hat aber schon früher angefangen, nämlich mit dem Abzug aus Afghanistan.
But that actually started earlier, with the withdrawal from Afghanistan. When the Americans pulled out of Afghanistan, head over heels after 20 years of occupation, the Gulf states could already see what that meant. They thought, we're the Arab supporters of the U.S., and the same thing will probably happen to us. And that's when they began looking toward groups like BRICS, strengthening their ties with China, and deepening their relations with Russia. So this is definitely a development the United States can't reverse.
Professor Richard Wolff from New York said in a conversation with Glenn Deason that we're witnessing the decline of a world power, of a hegemon. Would you agree with that?
Ja, schon länger. Also das ist natürlich,
Yes, for quite some time now. You know, when you report from a certain region, you tend to develop a bit of tunnel vision about it. And the Near and Middle East are incredibly diverse, with a lot of different interests at play. But it's clear that even under Obama, the Americans had already started focusing on what they saw as the new major rival, China. That shift meant it's really no surprise that the Arab Gulf states began looking for new partners once the U.S. started stepping back in that way. Many conflicts in the region are still ongoing, and of course, U.S. interests there remain significant, as we've seen again recently. But they just can't play the same role anymore. They've lost the trust of the countries in the region, and that's been the case for quite a while.
Sie haben das Vertrauen verloren bei den Staaten der Region schon lange. Mit dem Irakkrieg hat es schon angefangen, mit dem Rückzug aus
It started with the
Afghanistan
Iraq War,
und
then
die
continued with
endlose
the withdrawal
Unterstützung
from
von Israel,
Afghanistan and the endless
die
support for
natürlich die
Israel.
Staaten der Region, also
The
die
countries in the
Krim,
region, of
Folgen
course,
davon.
are the ones who feel
Es
the
drängen darauf,
consequences
mit
of all that.
Israel ein
The pressure to sign a normalization agreement with
schließen,
Israel, which
was
completely
also
ignored the core conflict in the
den
region,
Kernkonflikt
the
in der
situation in
Region, die
Palestine.
Palästina
All of that has led to a
Situation von
deep
Palästina
sense of
überhaupt nicht
alienation.
berücksichtigt hat. Das alles hat zu einer großen Entfremdung geführt, ja.
Die Golfstaaten lernen.
The Gulf states are learning a lesson. The Americans can't protect us. Maybe they don't even want to. Is that a lesson European politicians still need to learn? Is that where Europe's war hysteria comes from?
Die Kriegshysterie in Europa?
Also ich denke, es war schon so, dass
Well, I think it's clear that the situation in Ukraine was an escalation that had been coming for a long time. It didn't start in 2022. It actually began back in 2014. That's when Russia tried to negotiate a security agreement for Europe and for itself. All of that was blocked by the West. So in that sense, the timing, the escalation in Ukraine, and especially against Russia, is connected to the European Union's and particularly the European Commission's attempt to expand like an empire, reaching into the Eastern European states and even beyond, across the Eastern Mediterranean.
Und auch weiter über das östliche Mittelmeer hinaus. Es gibt ja diesen Plan von Greater Middle East. Das war
There was this plan called the Greater Middle East. Back then, it was part of the G8, when Russia was still involved. It was a proposal from the United States to expand the Middle East into a broader area of interest, especially for Europe. That meant the entire Mediterranean region, basically the whole Mediterranean basin, including the Levant. It started up north with the Scandinavian area, meaning Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and stretched all the way down to Syria and Lebanon, then continued across North Africa to the Atlantic. There's even a map of it. The Europeans called it the neighborhood policy, but in reality, or de facto, it was an imperial expansion of European interests. And this happened in France, in coordination with the Americans, who at that time, in the early 2000s, wanted to pull back from the region in order to confront or prepare to confront China.
Damals, Anfang der 2000er Jahre. Und dass Europa dann praktisch eine Art
and that Europe is supposed to take on, together with Israel, a kind of guardian role in that part of the Middle East. And that also included the front with Ukraine that we see today, the front between Ukraine and Russia. So what I'm saying is this is really part of a project of imperial expansion by the European Commission, because the Union itself actually had other interests and internal conflicts it needed to resolve. And in that, the European Union has completely failed. It plays no role at all in the region today.
Back to the Strait of Hormuz. In recent years, the Iranians had to watch as the United States imposed sanctions. They were hit with tough sanctions. Billions in foreign assets were frozen. What's the situation with that?
In diesem Memorandum of Understanding steht, dass
This Memorandum of Understanding says that all sanctions are to be lifted. The United States is supposed to roll back its sanctions, which it has been tightening and expanding for 47 years, step by step, until they're all gone. It also says that the U.S. will work within the UN Security Council to ensure that all sanctions imposed by the Council, at the request and with the support of the United States, are lifted. So in other words, a reversal process is supposed to take place. The same goes for the sanctions promoted by the International Atomic Energy Agency, partly at the initiative of the so-called E3, Britain, France, and Germany, against Iran. Those are all supposed to be lifted as well. And at the same time, all sanctions affecting banks, transfer systems, and transactions with the Iranian Central Bank are to be removed too. All of that is meant to be rolled back. That's what it says.
Zurückabgewickelt werden, steht da drin.
Da würde ich sagen, das ist, da ist der
I'd say Iran is on the winning side here. Absolutely. Now, if we look at the so-called nuclear program, I'd conclude, if I had any say in Tehran, that the only thing protecting us from the United States is the North Korea model. We need the bomb. Is that how people in Iran would see it?
Wir brauchen die Bombe. Wird man im Iran das so sehen?
In diesem Memory of Understanding steht, dass die Islamische
In this Memorandum of Understanding, it says that the Islamic Republic of Iran is not pursuing nuclear weapons, but insists on its right to civilian nuclear energy. That's also why they're holding on to their enriched uranium. They don't intend to give it up. They've proposed not to liquefy it, technically, but to neutralize it, so to speak, to make sure it's no longer weapons grade. When you talk to official Iranian representatives or just listen to them, that's the position they take. And I think especially under Ali Khamenei, whom Israel and the United States actually tried to assassinate right at the start of this last war, he's always been, in fact, an opponent of the atomic bomb.
war immer ein Gegner eigentlich der Atombombe. Hat das ganz klar gesagt. Das entspricht nicht.
He said it very clearly. This does not align with our Islamic values. Iran is one of the countries that has repeatedly called for the entire region to be free of weapons of mass destruction. No chemical weapons, no biological weapons, no nuclear weapons. And as we know, Israel is basically the only country that actually pursues such programs. Of course, after the attack last year, which has almost been forgotten by now, it was in June, and then the more recent attack on Iran, the voices inside Iran and also outside the country have grown louder, saying, we would understand if Iran decided to get the atomic bomb now.
Sich die Atombombe zulegt. Das ist eine Diskussion, würde ich sagen.
I'd call that a matter of debate. The official position is that in the Islamic Republic of Iran, this kind of weapon isn't used. They've made all sorts of major advances with ballistic missiles and conventional weapons, which they use very skillfully, and with intelligence capabilities they have today that they didn't have before. And with that, they've basically achieved the situation we see now. So, in a way, I think that confirms the view of those who say, we reject this type of weapon, and we don't need it. We've developed other very effective weapons.
Wir haben gute andere Waffen entwickelt.
Former CIA analyst Larry Johnson believes that Iran still has about 70% of its missiles. How do you see it?
Das ist, ich habe keine Geheimdienste.
I don't have any intelligence information, so it's really hard to say. There are some videos from Iranian sources that show these underground storage sites, or at least parts of them. They look well stocked, basically filled to the ceiling. I can't confirm that, but what Iran has shown is that even under the toughest conditions, it's capable of building and developing missiles and drones. They can do that, and they've proven it.
Das können sie und das haben sie bewiesen.
What has changed geopolitically up to this Memorandum of Understanding?
Verändert.
Also was sehr deutlich ist, dass die arabischen Golfstaaten.
What's very clear is that the Arab Gulf states are moving away from the United States, except for the United Arab Emirates. And that's an important point. The Emirates signed what's known as the Abraham Accords with Israel, I think about 4 years ago, and they've built a close partnership with Israel. They've apparently supported Israel in attacks on Iran and probably on Qatar as well. Also, their withdrawal from OPEC Plus was basically a show of support for the U.S. position on oil policy. Aside from that, it's clear that Iran is much stronger now than it was before the war, and Hezbollah in Lebanon has gained a strong position through its resistance against the Israeli army. That, without a doubt, is a very clear signal.
Das ist auf jeden Fall ein ganz deutliches Zeichen. Der Oberkommandierende der Revolutionsgarden im Iran.
The commander-in-chief of Iran's Revolutionary Guard, Khani, made a statement saying that we no longer have what he called an axis of resistance in the military sense, but rather a defensive alliance, a defense alliance of the resistance. By that, he means the units, the militias in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen, and Hezbollah, which together with Iran can now, so to speak, control the region militarily. So the Red Sea and Bab al-Mandab, That's another key strait connecting the Arabian Sea to the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. And the Persian Gulf, this whole area is, as he put it, practically under the control of this defensive alliance of the resistance. And he described that as a completely new balance of power, which in fact it is.
Kräfteverhältnis beschrieben, was es de facto ist.
Has Washington's attempt as a hegemon failed to gain control over energy flows and cut China off from key oil and gas suppliers?
In Bezug auf China, nein. Ist es nicht gelungen.
About China? No, that didn't work, because Iran's relations with China are stable. They have various agreements. And even when the Strait of Hormuz was officially closed, tankers bound for China were still able to leave the region. Well, maybe the United States looked the other way on that. I don't know. But I think China is pursuing a very skillful policy in the region, always staying in dialogue with everyone, offering support where it makes sense, but not getting involved militarily. China doesn't want to do that. So I don't think the region is lost for China, even though that was, in a way, one of the Americans' goals.
Nicht verloren ist, obwohl eben halt das auch mit ein Ziel war der Amerikaner.
With the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline, Germany in particular, but also Europe as a whole, has fallen into the energy trap of the United States. We've become energy slaves to the U.S. Are the United States now trying to do something similar through this war against Iran, using their vassals in the Pacific and in Asia?
Im Pazifik, in Asien?
Nun,
well, they're definitely already working on encircling China, but whether they'll actually succeed, that's the big question. Because, of course, the Asian countries are also watching what's happening with Iran right now, what the United States is announcing, and what it's actually able to deliver. I think the loss of confidence in the capabilities of the U.S. armed forces, as well as in their political will and reliability, is being viewed with a lot of skepticism and caution by those Asian countries.
Mit großer Skepsis und Vorsicht beobachtet wird.
Are the Europeans the ones getting the short end of the stick here? The Americans have their own energy resources. The Europeans were cut off from the Russian ones and, in part, had to rely on oil and gas from the Near and Middle East. Those were missing at least for a while, too. So in the end, it's the European Union that's footing the bill, isn't it?
Die Europäische Union zahlt die Zeche, oder?
Sagen wir mal, Sie haben ja vielfach, sind Sie falsch abgebogen.
Let's put it this way. They've taken the wrong turn many times in their policies. So yes, they bear responsibility for the position they're in now because they simply weren't able to develop an independent European policy. This whole idea of we're an empire together with the Americans and the Middle East and the Mediterranean are our sphere of interest, that kind of language just doesn't work anymore. This notion of hegemony over other regions and other peoples, it no longer holds.
Über andere Regionen und über andere Völker. Ich glaube, das hat die Politik
I think that politics in the European Union, especially the European Commission, which has basically taken more and more decision-making power for the whole EU, has driven itself into a dead end. They're just not being taken seriously anymore. In the Middle East, not at all. And of course, they'd sell their liquefied gas or their oil to Germany again. That was never really the problem before. The war was just used as a pretext here in Europe. So I think they've put themselves into the completely wrong kind of dependency on the Americans, and to some extent also on Israel. And that's still going on right now between Germany and Israel. Yes, they're the ones paying the price, but it's also their own fault.
Die Regierungen.
The governments. Of course, the government. That's what we're talking about. In the end, it's the taxpayers who will have to pick up the tab. So if we take a look at the overall picture now, did the attackers, Washington and Israel, misjudge the situation? Did they miscalculate?
Unbedingt. unbedingt. Also ich denke, ich denke, dass Washington
Absolutely. I think Washington has followed Israel's lead. You really have to take into account how strong the influence of Israel's supporters is on U.S. politics. I mean, when you see Netanyahu speaking before Congress and getting 20 minutes of standing ovations, that's a bit un-American, I'd say. The dependence of U.S. politics, or of certain politicians, on Israel's backers in the United States has, in my view, led to wrong decisions in Washington. And Netanyahu seemed to think the whole region belonged to him. He used excessive force everywhere. Just look at Lebanon. And also what he did in Syria, where he sent in troops and basically cut off the south from the rest of the country.
Süden abgeschnitten vom Rest des Landes. Also, ich denke, dass Netanyahu sich.
I think Netanyahu has completely overestimated himself. He thought, to put it bluntly, that he basically had Trump in his pocket. But Foreign Minister Rubio said in an interview with Fox that the U.S. is now following its own interests. He said, "We know Mr. Netanyahu and Israel don't like that, but for now our interests come first in negotiating this Memorandum of Understanding." And that means just a few months before the new election in Israel, Netanyahu is now under enormous pressure.
Dass jetzt Netanyahu enorm unter Druck ist.
So what does that actually mean for the interests of the United States? What were they trying to achieve with this war?
Also sie wollten auf jeden Fall erreichen, dass ein Regime change.
So, what they definitely wanted to achieve was a regime change. That's what they were after. And the destruction of the nuclear facilities. I mean, who bombs nuclear facilities? That's a war crime, plain and simple. And they basically ignored international law, the UN Charter, all the rules, together with Israel. They did that because they thought they could finish it in a week. That's why the leaders were targeted and killed right away. Both in June of last year and again this February when the war started up again.
Also Ende Februar, als der Krieg wieder aufgenommen wurde. Und sie haben gedacht, sie können.
They thought they could use the protests that took place in Iran as an opportunity to launch an attack on the regime, basically to push for regime change, and to mobilize their regional proxy forces, like the Kurds, to move in and take control of certain positions. That idea was completely absurd. It only shows that they don't understand Iran, just like the Europeans don't. Their thinking was, either bring about regime change or break the country apart, divide and rule, to trigger internal conflicts within Iran. But they didn't expect the reaction they got.
Auseinandersetzung geben soll. Und die Reaktion haben sie nicht erwartet.
Iran is the
southernmost point of Russia's north-south corridor, stretching from St. Petersburg all the way down to the Persian Gulf. At the same time, Iran is a key hub in China's new Silk Road project. So was this really about something else entirely? Was the goal to weaken Russia, to drive a wedge into the sensitive underbelly of the Russian Federation? Or was it about blocking China's trade routes?
Chinesischen Handelswege zu blockieren?
Unbedingt. Sie haben völlig recht. Das stand
Absolutely. You're completely right. That was definitely in the background for certain strategists in the United States. I don't think that was as much the case in Israel. They simply wanted to push through the idea of Greater Israel. With the concept of a Greater Middle East, Israel was supposed to be part of it and expand its reach. But of course, you're absolutely right. Everything you just said, all those military activities, all the sanctions, everything directed against Iran, it's really aimed at Iran's connection with Russia and its ties with Asia and with China. That's a plan that's been around for a very long time. And the European Commission, good that you brought that up again, because this Silk Road project has actually been quite a successful initiative in that region.
Dieses Seidenstraßenprojekt ist ja ein ganz erfolgreiches Projekt in der Region. Und Frau von der Leyen hat vor wenigen Jahren dann.
And a few years ago, Ursula von der Leyen announced what she called a European Counter Project. Basically, an initiative to build transport and trade routes that are European-controlled and European-financed, clearly positioned against the Belt and Road Project. One of those plans even made headlines, a connection running from India, across the Arabian Peninsula, through Israel and the Mediterranean, all the way to Europe. There was a declaration of intent for that, supported by the Americans as well. It was clearly meant as an alternative to the Belt and Road model. But I think that project already has such a big head start. In my view, the Americans and Europeans have a completely wrong idea about the kinds of relationships that have already developed around the Belt and Road Initiative between China and the countries taking part in it.
Schauen wir auf Israel. Sie haben von
Let's look at Israel. You mentioned the project of Greater Israel. What was Netanyahu trying to achieve? Was it the idea of Greater Israel, from the Nile to the Euphrates?
bis zum Euphrat?
Ja, wird ja unterstützt von den rechten Siedlern, von den
Yes, he's being supported by the right-wing settlers, by the settler movement. They've already gone into Lebanon, they've gone into Syria, and started putting up the first huts there. So that's his base. He has to keep them satisfied with his policies. Apart from that, Netanyahu is also in a way shaped by his family background. He was raised that way by his father, together with his brother, who later died in a war. So I'd say he's a successor of the original Zionists, those who, from the very beginning, had the plan to establish Israel in that region and then expand from there to fulfill the mission of restoring Israel across the whole area. Settler colonialism.
Israel das ganze Gebiet wieder kontrollieren soll. Das ist eine religiöse Bewegung, die sich vermischt mit Machtpolitik.
Siedlerkolonialismus?
Ist das Instrument.
Das heißt, wir
That means we're settling the land and driving the others out.
Obwohl sie wissen, dass die anderen da sind, und zwar von Anfang an.
Even though they know the others have been there from the very beginning. And there are people, observers in the region, who say that this struggle by the Palestinians, or also by the Lebanese, is actually the last anti-colonial liberation struggle we're seeing. And that Israel, in a sense, is the last colony still there, one that will inevitably be destroyed or collapse from within. The internal conflicts inside Israel are enormous. They're played out mostly in the media. And in my view, the way the region sees the state of Israel is exactly that, as a colony of the old Western imperial powers.
Alten westlichen imperialen Mächte. Großbritannien auf jeden Fall. Man muss zurückgehen zum Ersten Weltkrieg.
Definitely the United Kingdom. You really have to go back to World War I, and even before that. So they had this idea. I was talking recently with someone. Well, Ireland fought for a very long time against British domination in Ireland, in Northern Ireland. And he pointed out that during World War I, the British said, we need a little Ulster in the Middle East, meaning like the city of Ulster in Northern Ireland, a kind of stronghold where they could station their military forces. That was the British idea at the time, and the French supported it too during the First World War.
Der Gedanke der Briten damals und auch die Franzosen haben das unterstützt im Ersten Weltkrieg. Es ist gut, wenn man in die Geschichte zurückgeht. Heute gibt es viel aufgearbeitet.
It's good to look back at history. A lot has been researched and documented by now, including by Israeli historians. And there are plenty of sources from Britain that clearly show Israel was meant to be built up and supported as a kind of base in that region. Why? Because of the oil, so they could secure access to it. And as the British said at the time, they didn't just want the oil fields, they also wanted to control the ports through which the oil would be shipped to them. That was already the case during the Paris Peace Conference after the First World War. They were at the table back then.
Nach dem Ersten Weltkrieg saßen die mit am Tisch.
Da kommt der Gazastreifen ins Spiel, nämlich zum einen.
That's where the Gaza Strip comes into play. First, as a possible route for a pipeline, and second, because of the gas reserves located off its coast. And for example, the Rothschilds have already shown interest in that. Was this a driving factor behind Israel's mass killing of Palestinians?
Beim Massenmord Israels gegenüber den Palästinensern.
Ich glaube, das treibende Element war tatsächlich der Rassismus.
I believe the driving force was really racism against the Palestinians. They were meant to be destroyed, expelled. I think that was truly a key motive for those who are funding this, people who aren't necessarily in the country, but who support it from the outside in one way or another with money and weapons. And of course, the untapped gas fields in the eastern Mediterranean play a major role. Off the coast of Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, and around Cyprus, there are huge issues. Gas reserves that haven't been fully explored yet. There's already conflict over who gets access to what, including disputes involving Turkey and the European Union. Earlier, I talked about this imperial European project, the idea of controlling the entire region, everything around the Mediterranean. That includes the natural resources, both on land and at sea. So yes, that clearly plays a major role.
For the people in Gaza, the consequences are terrible. Out of the public eye, the fighting there continues, doesn't it?
Die Angriffe. Also es gibt keine richtigen Kämpfe. Es gibt
The attacks. Well, there aren't really any actual battles going on. Hamas has now said, after the latest talks in Cairo, that they would hand over their weapons to a special authority, basically a Palestinian authority. But the police inside Gaza are supposed to stay armed, and Israel has also supported militias. They've built, armed, and funded militias that have fought inside the Gaza Strip against Hamas and other groups.
Gegen die Hamas und andere Organisationen gekämpft hat. Das war schon vor dem Krieg übrigens so. Die haben sogar, das sind Einheiten, die haben mit Daesh, also mit dem islamischen Staat, auch auf der Sinai-Halbinsel gekämpft. Also die Angriffe von Israel gehen weiter.
The attacks by Israel are continuing, targeted strikes on the refugee camps, and they're expanding their area of control. By now, it's around 70%. They had drawn what they called a yellow line. That yellow line turned into an orange one, I think. And now they've moved a bit beyond that again. And when you listen to the people there, they're being cut off, not only from their original homes, which have been destroyed, but also from the fields, from the farmland the Palestinians used to work. So their means of living are being taken away more and more. And this so-called Board of Peace that Mr. Trump so proudly launched, well, I'd say it started out like a tiger and ended up as a doormat. In reality, it just didn't work out that way.
So, under the leadership of, let's be clear about this, war criminal Tony Blair, a private consortium was supposed to turn the Gaza Strip from a landscape of ruins into a vacation paradise. Whatever happened to that?
Ja, das wurde ja beim Weltwirtschaftsgipfel in Davos hat das der
That came up a lot at the World Economic Forum in Davos. Jared Kushner even gave a PowerPoint presentation there, showing everyone how he imagined it would work. Completely absurd. Right now, that's not even on the table. The Israelis are still advancing, still bombing. There are talks going on with Hamas and with mediators in Cairo. But that committee that was supposed to be set up, I'm not even sure if everyone's been appointed yet. It's basically not active.
Are
the Palestinians being driven out of Gaza?
Das ist das Ziel.
That's the goal. It doesn't work because Egypt doesn't want it. And economically, they can't do it either. We have to ask the same question about the West Bank. It doesn't work there because Jordan rejects it. So, yes, they could do it.
A state that already has hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees.
Ja, mehrheitlich. Die Bevölkerung ist mehrheitlich palästinensisch tatsächlich. Und eigentlich sieht man an allen Grenzen Israels, dass also diese ganzen Pläne, die auch von der UNO abgesegnet wurden, Zwei-Staaten-Lösung und wie auch immer.
And anyway, that whole idea has really been made absurd by Israel's rejection of it. Even when they sat at the negotiating table, they didn't care about it afterward. The goal of the settler movement, of the ministers who represent them, including the current ministers in Netanyahu's government, is to support more settlement building in the West Bank and the expulsion from Gaza. But I think in practice, that's simply not feasible.
Aus Gaza, aber ich denke, es ist de facto einfach nicht machbar.
Aside from the fact that people don't want that, the Palestinians want to stay.
And it's a similar situation in the West Bank. You mentioned it earlier. The Israelis are also trying to expand their settlements there. What's happening on the ground?
Was geschieht da?
Also, das ist
There are daily attacks on villages, on settlement communities, also from the Bedouins, for example, who have livestock too. Their animals are stolen by settlers, their houses and barns are set on fire, and people are even shot. So, every day there are deaths. These settlers often come at night, storm into the villages, drag people out of their sleep and drive them away. Honestly, I can hardly find the words to describe it.
Mir fehlen da eigentlich die Worte für, wie man das beschreiben soll.
The chancellor made a statement about Iran. He said Israel is doing the dirty work for us. What's your take on that?
Was halten Sie davon?
Naja, das macht vor allen Dingen deutlich,
Well, what this really shows is that there's a kind of complicity here, at least between Germany and Israel, in how this is being handled. And everything you're saying, like having a communication channel with the Israeli government, not needing to impose sanctions, or not having to freeze the association agreement at the EU level, all of that is supposedly unnecessary because, after all, there's dialogue with Israel. Germany buys weapons from Israel. There are agreements for the German police and border police, the federal police, to be trained by Israeli units to learn from their experiences in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip. That's cynical. So yes, they're accomplices. There's a complicity there that could, if international law is ever properly enforced again, possibly even end up before the International Criminal Court, including the Germans.
Internationalen Strafgerichtshof landen werden, die Deutschen.
Es gab eine scharfe Diskussion bei
There was a heated discussion at a staff meeting in the Foreign Office, where some employees called for a tougher stance toward Israel. They apparently fear they could be arrested abroad outside the European Union. How are those two things connected?
Wie hängt das miteinander zusammen?
Ja, das ist genau diese, also es gibt ja.
Yes, that's exactly it. There are a number of charges against Germans who also hold Israeli citizenship, people who are then called up as reservists and take part in military operations. Some of these cases have come to light in Frankfurt. And of course, if the Foreign Office allows them to be sent or recalled in such a situation to perform military service in Israel against the Palestinians, then their relatives here in Germany can also file lawsuits. Not only against those individuals, but also against the Federal Republic of Germany, because Germany has supplied weapons that have been used in this war.
Die in diesen Krieg eingesetzt worden sind. Sie verweisen ja immer darauf, dass sie
You keep pointing out that they don't deliver certain weapons at all. But they do supply parts for the Merkava tank, which is heavily involved, not just in Gaza, but also in Lebanon and in Syria, to destroy targets there, and of course to fire as part of the artillery. And there are so many families, relatives who are affected by this. They live here in Germany, in France, or in England. By now, there are quite a few criminal complaints and legal proceedings when that, and Germany will certainly have to answer for that.
Da wird Deutschland sicherlich sich zu verantworten haben.
And a country like Nicaragua has filed a lawsuit against Germany for aiding genocide. What's the current status of that case?
Wie ist der Sachstand?
That was rejected by the International Criminal Court.
Wie geht es weiter im
What happens next in Syria? You said Israel has cut off the southern part of the country. Is the goal to break this country apart, to push it into an endless civil war? What are the ideas coming out of Tel Aviv?
Was sind die Vorstellungen in Tel Aviv?
Also Tel Aviv hat sofort gehandelt, als
So Tel Aviv acted immediately when, well, there was a ceasefire in Lebanon between Hezbollah and Israel. That was on November 24th, I think, or maybe at the end of November 24. And those Jolani troops, let's say the Islamist groups that had been in Idlib for the past few years, they immediately took that as a reason to advance on Aleppo. So it's quite clear there was an agreement that Israel would at that point also agree to the ceasefire and at the same time move forward in Syria to take advantage of the government's collapse for its own purposes.
Der Regierung dann auszunutzen für sich. Die sind über den besetzten Golan, über die...
They moved in across the occupied Golan through the buffer zone that's controlled by the United Nations. In their airstrikes, more than 500 of them, they destroyed all of Syria's military facilities across the country, including the small fleet they had in the port of Aleppo, which they sank. And they built military bases right there in the UN-controlled buffer zone on the Golan Heights. That's a narrow strip of land that basically lay between Syria and the part of the Golan that's occupied and annexed by Israel. The Israelis set up 5 or 6 military bases there almost immediately.
5 oder 6 Militärbasen sofort aufgebaut. Sie haben den Berg Hermon eingenommen, also die Spitze.
They took Mount Hermon, the summit. That area had been under Syrian control. Of course, at the top, the Syrian army had its military installations. The Israelis captured it, raised their flag there, and shared the photos. And that, for example, allowed them to monitor all communications between Beirut and Damascus from that mountain. I remember my own phone. Suddenly I got a message on it. I was in Damascus on Mount Qasiyun, the city's own mountain. And suddenly my phone went ding, 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 and I got a message saying, "Welcome to Israel."
Auf einmal kriege ich Klingelingeling auf meinem Handy eine Nachricht, "Welcome to Israel."
Wie hoch ist das Risiko?
How high is the risk that Israel could get drawn into an armed conflict with Turkey because of the war in Syria?
Ja, das ist real.
Yes, that's real. Right now, the United States is kind of standing in between, allowing both sides to control certain areas, more or less. So as Israel has moved in from the south, it's basically enforced that no weapons are allowed to remain in the hands of Syrian authorities in southern Syria. And in effect, they've cut off Suwaida. There's now a sort of border between the province of Damascus and the province of Suwaida. There are checkpoints on both sides that cut, and when you enter Suwaida, there's a control post with a Star of David painted on it, and the Israeli flag is flying there.
Und in Suwaida hängt die israelische Fahne.
Can we put it simply like this? In the north, Turkey is advancing into Syria. In the south, the Israelis are moving forward, and in between, the Americans are sitting on the oil fields they're illegally holding.
Genau, und dann gibt es eben halt in der Mitte zwischen den dreien sozusagen.
Right, and then in the middle, between those three, basically around Damascus, there's Mr. Jolani, that is Mr. Ahmed al-Shara, who's trying to present himself as a kind of Syrian president.
Darstellen soll, dass ein syrischer Präsident ist.
And he's being received in Germany like a head of state, even though he's a murderer.
Ja, leider haben die Vereinten Nationen ihn auch schon freigesprochen.
Yes, unfortunately, the United Nations has already cleared him. So the Security Council has, well, it's obviously it's complicated, as I said at the beginning. Everything connected to that region, what's happened there in recent years, what's being destroyed, who's trying to assert themselves, all of that is really a massive attack on what we in Europe have learned since World War II, both in school and in terms of law. It's about our understanding of international law, of human rights, and so on. All of that has been turned completely upside down there. And I have to say, with this outcome now with Iran, at least for the moment, a kind of barrier has been put in place. How far that will hold in other countries and internationally remains to be seen.
Und auch international. Aber man muss einfach anerkennen,
but we have to acknowledge how far this will actually go is still an open question. Still, we have to recognize that it was really Iran that made sure, through its actions and its policies, and yes, through its victory now, that at least the principles of international law, sovereignty and territorial integrity, are still being upheld. That's also written into the Memorandum of Understanding, which, by the way, in parts, reads almost as if it were copied straight from the UN Charter. And that's certainly thanks to the Iranians, who are excellent diplomats and who helped found the United Nations after World War II. So it's really to their credit that, at least for the moment, there's still something we can refer to. And we should, by the way, actually do that.
Would you say that Iran defended international law against the superior power of Israel, the United States, and Europe? Yes, that's exactly my view. Karin Leukefeld, the Middle East expert, says that Iran, through its victory in the conflict with the attackers, Israel and the United States, has defended international law. Thank you for that.
Thank you as well.
Here at Against the Current, we present viewpoints and perspectives that the propaganda media keep hidden.
Verschweigen.